Change is the only constant, especially in the corporate world. Yet studies show that there is a 70% of change initiatives failing due to employee resistance and lack of management support. You will ask why. It is because beneath this polished presentation and strategic plans, there is a hidden wall of challenges, anxieties, and unspoken truth that we are kind of ashamed of talking about it because we want to show that our change was different and it was successful. Today, we are pulling back the curtain of the change management secrets nobody talks about. We are going to discuss about the messy human side of transformation, explore gaps between the theory and reality, and uncover the strategies that truly make change happen. Joining us today is Karen Ball, a seasoned change management practitioner and ADKAR expert. Karen Ball is a senior fellow of Prosci, well known, by the way. We were just discussing about Karen that it happened that I had to use also this the ADKAR method approach, back in my corporate days. So previously, Karen served as a Prosci Executive Vice President of Research, Product and Marketing, and for over 4 years, she has helped people and organizations implement effective changes and achieve the desired benefits as a result. Karen is also the author and kind of, I have to say, a reference book called the ADKAR Advantage, Your New Lens for Successful Change. And she is the most appropriate person to discuss the topic today, which is about the change management secrets that nobody talks about. Let's gossip about it, Karen.
Sounds good. Thank you.
It is. I'm so excited about our conversation because when I was thinking about the type of questions that I would be interested to ask you, it only came to the questions where I was facing these moments of dilemmas on change management that I couldn't solve and nobody could answer to me inside of my corporate life. Karen, before that, I just wanted to get to know a little bit more about you. So how did you end up working, let's call it as a consultant for change in organization? What was the reason that made you move to that world?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. It's interesting as we reflect on, the discipline of change management. And I have to tell you, if you ask just about anyone who considers themselves to be a change practitioner or a change professional, how they found their way into this discipline, you're going to find lots of different stories. For me, myself, I graduated from university and I went into the work in the space of information technology and was working with organizations for many, many years who were implementing large scale technology changes and in many cases investing millions of dollars into those changes. And I just continuously had this sinking feeling as I was working with customers and clients that they were missing something really critical. And of course, my work was focused on information technology strategy and design and development and delivering solutions into the space of change that were focused on what we would consider the technical side of the change, not just technology, but what was changing. And I just always had this gnawing feeling that we were missing something significant. And I always called it end user adoption because I really just didn't know what to call it other than the fact that our investments in technology are not going to deliver the benefits that are intended if we don't help people who are going to be embracing these changes to use them effectively and to apply them as they were designed and to know how to do what we were asking them to do. And in 2006, I was at a client in Boise, Idaho, and I remember the day and the room and everything that was going on because it was one of those professional moments that really anchored for me. But the client said to me, we've got a training class this afternoon for all of our managers. And so the people you're working with are not going to be available. Do you want to just sit in with us and join the session? And of course, I'm like, well, of course I do, right? Any opportunity for some professional development. And the program that they were sitting in and being introduced to was being delivered by Prosci. And it was about change management, and it introduced the ADKAR model and the individual transitions that every single person goes through to realize the successful outcomes of change, both individually and organizationally. And I had a moment where I thought, oh my, there's the piece. There's the piece I've known in my gut and in my professional ability to see what's missing. It has a name. It's called change management. And there are models and methodologies and practices and organizations that support, equip, and enable people through change. So I just did a deep dive on change management as a discipline, what Prosci was doing, what others were doing in the marketplace. And just a few years later, I was asked to launch a change management practice for the same company that I was working for. So I had an opportunity to shore up a professional aligned method to focus on not just the technology and what we were delivering in change, but also to help people go through the change process so that the technologies are successfully adopted and benefits are realized. So it was that moment in 2006, and then just, doing my hard work of learning the discipline and studying and reading and watching every podcast and learning about what it means to help people through change, to come to the point where I felt like I was equipped to be a change leader and a change practitioner and to carry that forward in terms of the services that we offered as an organization. So that was my path from IT into change management.
You know what? It's almost like you and me, we have been facing this moment of, I understand what the ADKAR model is, but we had a different ways of getting it. I was mentioning to you before that back in my days, it was like, you're responsible for innovation, read this book, and try to imagine what it is. While you had the real experience of going through a practitioner who can explain you beyond the concepts of what that car means, how to implement it. And that makes a big difference, because I can tell you, a lot of mistakes happen because I just read the book and I didn't fully understand the depth of what I had to do. And also the other thing that I have to highlight is that when you were talking about your first moment, I was thinking about this famous SAP implementation back in 2002, and the story that we created about this adoption by users, which was basically we train them and it is in their interest to digest and take it. And that was the plan for change management. Wow, what a difference. Back then, things were done completely different, Karen. Karen, I
Yeah,
want
no,
to.
the early thinking around change management was, well, we've got communications and training. Isn't that change management? And certainly communications and training are critical components of effective change management, but it's not the entirety, right? There is so much more in the depth. And it was interesting, you were just talking about just read a book and do it, right? Why can't we just read a book and do it?
Mm,
And, gosh, I read lots of books, and it didn't mean that I was still able to do it, right? The knowledge to ability, which by the way is captured, right in the middle of the ADKAR model, right? From awareness through desire, through knowledge to ability, and then reinforcement. And knowing how and being able are two very different things. And you'll see that perfectly as an example if you put me on the golf course. So knowing how to hold a golf club and swing a golf club does not mean that I am able to play golf.
mm,
And I just read an interesting article that it just comes to mind as we're sitting here chatting, and it's really probably something your listeners would explore too. It's the idea of simplicity that sits on the other side of complexity. So when you first learn something about a discipline or an organization or something that's going on in your life, you're sitting over on the simplicity of, I just know a little bit. And sometimes the assessments that we make or the way we communicate is simplistic and reductive. But it's when you dive in and you get into the complexity of things and you understand the nuances and the connections and you synthesize your thinking and models to the point where it almost becomes intuitive. And then
Mm,
you get on the other side again, but that doesn't mean you're able to communicate simply, right? So there's lots of people who know lots of things who get caught up in the complexity and they're not able to communicate effectively. But then you get to the simplicity on the other side of complexity. And now when you speak from the point of knowing and understanding, but you can get back to simplicity and articulating. And that's really, models like ADKAR is simplicity that sits on the other side of complexity.
mm. That's totally. It looks complex on the way that you can divide these steps, but at the end, you are fully right. And if, in fact, it all evolves to the point of the human being. How can we have enough knowledge in order to transmit to the other part in a way that the person can understand? How can we understand what is going through in the brain of a person that we are communicating change at that specific moment? How can we empathize enough in order to be able to uh, as a reflex, communicate in the most effective and powerful way so that they really engage with the change. And it is not, and very often we do this mistake of trying to convince someone that you need to change.
Hmm.
Change is good, more opportunities. No, people do not get it. It cannot be possible that we just buy a change that happens to the organization. If this change doesn't happen for me as an individual, or cannot be beneficial for me, or that it induces a fear of unknown, then of course I'm going to be like, oh, whoa, 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 I don't want to touch it.
Yeah, no,
Good.
there's a lot of psychology that sits behind change, right?
Yeah.
Or people have studied, the psychology of change, neuroscience, sociology, the psychological components of resistance, and how do we help people through change naturally? And effective change management incorporates all of those components, right? Understanding that communication is not telling plans, it's engagement, right? It's understanding where people are in the change process. And you and I could be exposed to the exact same change and respond very differently. So, if it's a highly complex technology change, I have an information technology background. So I don't naturally have some of the same fears that someone who does not have my background might have. So it's important to understand that communication isn't, one directional, right? There's feedback loops and there's engagement stories. And at the end of the day, of course, organizations need to implement specific changes to meet business goals and objectives, to accomplish strategy, to respond to competition in the marketplace or to shifts in dynamics that a year ago didn't exist that exist today. I mean, imagine all of the thinking that's going on and the challenges that exist around AI adoption. And, it's another technological shift, but it's also a behavioral shift. So there's a lot of things that have to come to play to look at it from, communication isn't a telling plan, it's an engagement strategy that includes the right people at the right time with the right messages. But somebody has to craft all of that. Somebody has to craft the strategy and the plan in the context of each organization and in the context of each change. And that's really the role of a change practitioner. It's not just to check off the list of the right assessments at the right time, but it's the intuitiveness that comes from being in this space of thinking, right? I can walk into an organization and have two or three conversations and very quickly start determining some of the characteristics of the challenges that they're having. And a lot of times that's leadership, right? If we don't have leadership knowing how to be effective leaders of change, just saying it doesn't make it happen.
Mm. That's right, Karen. I wanted to go a little bit into this area of what we don't talk about in terms of change, and organizations very often claim that to value innovation and adaptability. We know the story. So, but at the end, they may struggle with the change. What are some of the unspoken contradictions or hypocrisies that you have observed in organizations when it comes to change? Let's talk hard about the
Yeah.
realities of change in organizations.
Yeah, I think the one that I just mentioned is what comes to mind is saying it and doing it
Mm.
are two different things. So one of the contradictions might be, we're innovative, we are fast and dynamic and iterative, and we learn quickly and we fail and we go on. That is an interesting model of business. And, I have, lots of certifications in design thinking. We at Prosci leverage design thinking for product design. So we do our empathy exercises and we prototype and we test and we learn and we gain feedback. And, we try to bring, research informed products to market very quickly. But, at the end of the day, do the leaders in the organization understand what it means to lead iterative change? It means that they really have to step into their role of being role models for change, of, articulating why one change is related to another, the clear communications, not just on a specific initiative, but how everything connects. Because if there's something happening quickly, inside of an organization, it's probably part of the culture and it's probably represented in the way that change gets brought to life. So maybe there's agile methods for product and project delivery that are in execution. But the question becomes, are people actually building structure inside of the organization to support innovation and rapid iterations of change? Or do they just think that by declaring it happens? So, I want to challenge people to think about, change as a capability. And of course, if I want to get really strong, if I want that muscle to be really strong, to come alongside of innovation and rapid cycles and all of the things we talk about in terms of agile method and approaches, we have to build the muscle itself. So we have to isolate it, we have to exercise it, and we have to support and sustain it. So leaders need to know how to be effective leaders of rapid change. We need to have structures and methods and mechanisms that support rapid and effective change. We have to have methodology and process. We have to have metrics and performance that articulates that as a desired outcome. So a lot of that is very cultural, but just speaking it into existence requires all the actions that sit behind it.
Mm. Indeed, this part of resistance is always one of the biggest challenges. And I want to ask you a couple of questions about resistance. But before that, in fact, you made me think that when you were mentioning the iterative changes, is one of the concepts that is very hard to understand for people. I still remember that coming back to my example of SAP implementations in the 2000s, I still remember that when there was an error, these bloody consultants from SAP, they were expensive. So if you do an error and the acceptance is low of all of the changes that you have implemented, you have spent close to $1 million on an implementation that nobody's using. But then and I still remember that when we had a talk about using the agile methodology in order to reduce the risk of non-acceptance of the implementation, it was difficult for people to understand that, to forecast, but how much is going to cost if you are continuously improving, doing iterations. Our brain is almost like has been modeled in such a way that we don't like the uncertainty. When are we finished? So we
But what's the cost if we don't?
Exactly. And that, even when you have the examples, we have lost X millions because of this implementation that was completely wrong, and you're talking about iteration, it was still very, very difficult.
Yeah, and here's a hidden cost that a lot of times people don't think about, right? There's costs and risks in, doing it incorrectly, right? To force a technical solution that doesn't meet need, or to, let's just say we have a perfect technical solution, but we don't do anything to support and equip, enable people through the adoption strategy from their current state through transition into their new future state. But let's just say we do all of those things, to the best of our ability, and we still create a pretty bumpy implementation. Maybe we get there, right? Maybe over several iterations, we get to where we want to be with successful implementation. But in the process, you're teaching the people in your organization, we're not good at this. And when they start holding that belief, when the next big change comes along, they're going to be much more skeptical and they're going to go, don't you remember that one SAP implementation? Oh my gosh, that was so painful. It took so long. I don't think we're going to be good at this, right? We start building evidence inside of our organizations that we're not good at change. And we've got to flip that script because the investments that are being made, not only are they very costly, but in some cases, right, you're going to chase the most capable people out of your organization because they're not being supported through the change process. So there's a lot more costs and risks that sit behind, even reputational risk. I mean, I've seen organizations implementing customer facing technology solutions. And again, I'm talking about technology, but it could be the way the process is designed or the policies that drive organizational behaviors. And next thing you know, you've got reputational risk. So you're not only impacting the people inside your organization and teaching them you're not good at change, but you're teaching your customers that you're not good at change, right? How many of us have opened an app on our phones and it's completely different? Nobody told me this was going to happen. Nobody helped me get through the learning cycle. And I'm the one as a customer who has to figure it out. And boy, I'll tell you what, I might just as well look and see what somebody else is doing.
What else have you observed in terms of typical resistance forms that in organization? And I think it's good to have it in two parts. One, the resistance coming from leaders, because it's a different type of resistance, and the difference between the resistance coming from the staff, the people who are not yet leaders.
Yeah, resistance is interesting, right? We've used the word resistance in the change management discipline for many, many years. And, we are also likely to say resistance is a natural response to change. At Prosci, one of the things we want to do is reshape resistance as readiness, right? That resistance is a lack of readiness. And so it's incumbent upon us to get the organization ready so that we don't have demonstrated resistance. Now, some of the resistance you can't anticipate. But I love sitting down with a group of people who are going to be impacted by a change and asking them, what are you concerned about? What do you feel like the gaps are? What are you not understanding that you feel like you need to understand in order to be ready? Because we know that resistance can show up as being, very, passive, right? People don't go to training or they don't turn their cameras on in a conversation with, a person who's leading a workshop, for example. Or, they just kind of step away from it. And sometimes they're just exhausted, from all the changes that are happening and they get to the point of apathy. But resistance, or the way that we describe, it can also be exhibited as very active. There are people who act out and express vocally. And here's an interesting thing, right? The reframing from resistance to readiness is very powerful. And the ADKAR model, certainly comes alongside that because, readiness can show up in, awareness. And what we know from Prosci research is the number one reason for resistance to change or lack of readiness is that it's just awareness. They don't understand why a change is happening, why it's happening now, what would be the risk if it doesn't. So the ADKAR model gives us 5 placeholders, again, awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement to ensure readiness. So we communicate why now, what if we don't, what it looks like with, what is changing, what isn't changing, some of those awareness messages that get people past and ready for, I understand why to make a choice to participate. And desire is all about, I'm choosing to support the change. So our readiness, if we flip the script from resistance to readiness, means we have to support people in readiness with awareness and desire, and then knowledge, and then ability, and then reinforcement. So each of those gives us a place to activate the right people, the right interventions, feedback mechanisms and Q&A sessions and town halls and all of those places. So that's really, not just at the user level or the impacted person, but our leaders also have an ADKAR journey to be effective leaders of change. So I understand why a particular change is happening. I've sat in workshops with a table full of executive leaders to help them move a must-win change forward, something that's strategic, it's heavily invested, it's something that they've articulated is necessary for forward movement and health of the organization. And asking 6 or 8 or 10 senior leaders, are you all aligned on why this change is happening?
Hmm.
And you just sit back and watch the conversations because in many cases they are not. So how can you ask them? And again, if they're uncomfortable communicating the why, maybe the change doesn't originate from their part of the organization, but they're part of the sponsor coalition, and they should be positively advocating for the change. And they're afraid somebody's going to ask them a question that they don't know the answer to. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing it now? Why is this a priority over another significant change in the organization? So we really need to think about our leadership teams as individuals first, who have to go through their own ADKAR journeys, both in the context of change or changes and in the context of role fulfillment. I am aware of why I need to be an active and visible sponsor of change. I've decided to do that. I know how. I am able, and the reinforcement. So there's a lot of layers in that, making sure that our roles are actively being fulfilled, and we know effective leadership is the number one indicator of change success is leadership. Do our leaders know how to do that? Do they know how, and do they have alignment across their coalition to be able to articulate the key messages consistently across the organization so the cascades of messages are successful? And then down at the individual level, what are we doing to get people ready for change? And if we focus on that, the resistance naturally drops. I was working on a really large scale IT change for a major, an international oil and gas company. And we were doing an IT change that required, adoption on a single day. This particular change was a big bang change. It had to happen globally because we were implementing some new tools and software behind the scenes. And we were ready for, those hand-holding calls and, what could possibly go wrong? How are we going to mitigate? And we like to say, there were crickets. I mean, the day of go live, there were crickets. There was no sounds of concern. It was more the technology. So we had our help desks and our aides and all of those things, but people were ready. And we certainly didn't get the pushback that we had planned for, because we spent so much time on readiness to avoid resistance.
One of the major assumptions in order that resistance is, or to be more clear, the fear of the change disappears or dissolves, is the transparency. Now, in some cases, some leaders may think that it is better that certain information about the change is not known by the whole organization. Like, for instance, if there is an organizational impact and there is this change also implies reduction of staff. What's your take on that? Should leaders be fully transparent, talking about the risk? or should there be a way in between?
Yeah, there's so many nuances in that. Certainly, there are some organizations that are um, not able to share the details because of SEC filings in the United States or other concerns that might cause market implications if more people know about some of the details of the change. It happens a lot in mergers and acquisitions or
Mm,
divestitures or significant org structure changes. But I think that the biggest advice I can get, again, you have to, senior leaders have to rely on, the laws, first of all, right? And guidance by, legal counsel and individuals who will tell them what they can and cannot say. But I'm more inclined to, if we're building a culture of trust, that the more open and authentic you can be, the better. And when you build that trust, it becomes an economy inside of your organization, the
mm,
trust economy. You put something into, it's a ledger, right? I put things in one side and I get them on the other side. But there's also the possibility of, in that open and authentic communication, to be able to say to a group of people, I cannot at this time share all of the details with you, but please know that when I can, I will,
mm,
and to treat people with the level of courtesy and trust that we would expect for ourselves. There's a little bit of the golden rule inside of that. And if there are cases where you need to put people into non-disclosure agreements or to reinforce corporate ethics around communication, then activate those if you need to. But I believe that, our best, and the kind of leaders I want to have are the people that say, I trust you,
mm,
and I'm going to share some information with you. Now, you mentioned reduction in force. That is certainly never an easy implication of changes, but sometimes it's a necessary implication of change. And maybe the business driver that caused us to reimagine a new process or a new system or a new tool or new compensation structures or new locations, maybe part of the drivers was cost. And the way we were articulating, cost reduction was through reductions in force,
mm.
through identification of redundancies and so forth. Now, as a person who becomes redundant, that is certainly never, an easy transition. But again, I've worked with organizations who, I went with one organization who was going through a divestiture, and the divestiture included a whole line of business. And it was quite obvious to people who were in that line of business that they were
Mm.
going to be divested, right? That
Yeah.
that part of the business, and that not everyone would have a place in the future state. And that's where, again, it's so critical to be partners with so many other areas of the organization, whether it's OD or HR or, again, the support that you might need from your legal counsel. But in that case, the organization sat down with the employees and said, it's probably quite obvious to you that there's going to be an impact to a particular work group, and we are going to do our best to find other places for you in our organization, in the new organization, or if there isn't a place for you, we're going to help you transition. And here are the ways we're going to support you. So there are ways to be human in the middle of all of those changes. But, sometimes, mandates are mandates and requirements are requirements, and we can't avoid the messy part of the changes that we're implementing. But we do need to have the structure and the process and build that economy of trust through feedback and open communication, and, treat people the way we would want to be treated.
Absolutely. In some cases, even with the necessary knowledge and skills, individuals may struggle to break the old habits and adopt new behaviors. So a change that requires that I change the way I do things. How can leaders create this supportive environment that encourages experimentation and helps people overcome inertia?
Yeah. And I think we have to recognize that, status quo has an amazing staying power.
Mm,
We know that in our personal lives as well, right? We may know that there's something not working in a relationship or in our housing situation or in any other number of situations. And we know something's not working and we're working our way through what the future state might look like differently. But boy, I'll tell you, status quo is powerful, right? I'm comfortable here and I'm good at it. Even if it's not the most comfortable situation, I'm still good at the mechanisms, the mechanisms I've created for myself to be able to be successful. So we have to recognize that unseating status quo can take some work, and people have to unlearn sometimes to relearn. And experimentation is an amazing concept, right? Because in experimentation, and we know that in design thinking, right? When you create experiments
Mm.
and say, well, let's give it a try. Let's run it and see what the outcomes are. So people need to feel comfortable that if there's experimentation, they don't have to be perfect the first time.
Mm.
And I think that's one of the places even that the ADKAR language, the knowledge to ability gap really has to be called out, right? That can be a small gap, a medium gap, a large gap, an extra large gap. So knowing how and being able, and being able means we have to have coaching. Sometimes we have to have significant amount of practice to get really good at something. But here's the challenge that organizations run into is that they say that they have an experimenting and an adapting culture, but they don't give people time to
Mm.
do that.
Mm.
So do I have the resources and time that I need? I worked with one organization that they articulated this through a celebration event that they called the Failure Museum. And the Failure Museum was an elaborate display
Mm.
of exhibits of things that didn't go well.
Mm.
And it allowed people a space to see and experience learning, unlearning, and relearning, and articulating things that didn't go quite so well. So it's a fun way to put a spin on it that says, not only are we going to speak to experimentation and adaptation and giving space and time and resources to unlearn, relearn, and reseed or
Mm.
seed those new behaviors. But we're going to acknowledge the fact that it doesn't always go the way that we anticipated. But that kind of an environment, again, you're creating a culture of change. And a culture of change means that we know how to do it, our leaders know how to lead it. We have methods and process and structure and tools and mechanisms, and we have the checkpoints along the way to make sure we're doing what we want to be doing. So it really does require thinking deeper inside of it, right? When you go through that curve of complexity,
Mm.
you sit in the complexity for a bit so that you can get out the other side. So there's a lot of organizations that speak the words and don't act the way they want to create. So, and here's another trick, right? Another hack is, let's say we have an intent to create a culture of change, right? That change is welcomed. We know we're good at it. People immediately know which questions to ask if they're not getting the information they need. I think, the organizations where an employee feels comfortable saying, hey, I heard about this particular change. I'm really not connecting with why we're doing this. Can you help me understand? Right. So that's an example of the culture of change, all the way down to the individuals who are being asked to change, is they have the empowerment to ask the questions that they need answered. And I'll tell you a story about that in just a moment. But this culture of change, it's like, what are the behaviors that you would see? What do people think and say and feel and do, right? That's an empathy map, right? What do people think and see and feel and do differently in a culture that welcomes change? So I was collecting stories for the ADKAR book. So there's over 50 storytellers that I collected, personal and professional, individual and organizational change stories from around the world. There's 20 countries and 6 continents that are covered. And one of the participants in Japan, and again, it's cultural, right? There are very cultural differences inside of organizations in various places. But in Japan, of course, most of us have some awareness of some of the cultural markers of organizations in Japan. And the individuals in the organization that were in the impacted groups, the frontline workers, the people, the associates and employees who were heavily impacted by change, did not feel there were lots of changes going on, and they didn't feel like they were equipped with what they needed to know and do. So they created their own solution. They created a digital hub and started crowdsourcing communications and synthesizing themselves and posing questions that others of their peers were answering, not the management team. So again, that culture of change, what are the behavioral markers that we're implementing and designing and creating a culture that's positive towards change? And that's when you'll start to see leaders who know how to lead change and people who know how to receive change. And you start get this sentiment that bring it on, we're good at this, right? We know that in our industry, in any industry, right, we've got to adopt change quickly in order to succeed and survive and thrive.
I love
So
this
just some
example.
examples. Yeah. So we've got to understand, what does it look like? So stand in the future. We love to do an exercise called standing in the future. 3 years from now, 5 years from now, what are people seeing, thinking, feeling, doing at the enterprise level, at the project level, at the individual level, in leadership teams? And when you start creating that future state, you've just created a change management challenge, right? You've just now said, I've got a future state of change capability. I have a current state. Now change management takes change management. How do we get from where we want to be, where we are to where we want to be?
Something that we don't talk that often is about the mental health impact of change. Do you have any tips or about how can organizations acknowledge and mitigate these challenges regarding employee stress, burnout, or decreased morale because of the change? Because it may happen. Even if
Yes.
the economical impacts are positive, working in a moment of change is very, very tiring, intense.
Yeah, it's exhausting. We
Yeah.
know, brain science, neuroscience tells us, right, that forming new habits is exhausting, right? We use more energy in our bodies. So it's not just the mental aspects of that, but there's a physiological response as well. And, a lot of that has to do with, are we articulating clearly, again, our good, strong awareness messages from the right people? Does my manager or supervisor, right? So sometimes stress or concern for wellness and well-being comes from, am I going to be measured correctly?
Mm,
Because I'm going through a learning cycle and my performance metrics may fall off before they come back up again. So I may see some dips in my performance. And is that welcome and expected? And do I feel like I'm getting the support and resources to get up the curve on the other side? So again, some of this is structural, right? The measurements and mechanisms inside of our organizations. Just a simple conversation with my people manager who might look at me and say, Karen, I know this is a little bit stressful for you. You were the subject matter expert in the system that we're decommissioning. And now, you spent years taking on that subject matter expert role. And I can see for you, you might be feeling a little bit concerned about how you look and feel in the new, because you're not the subject matter expert. You're coming along the learning curve just like everyone else. And if you'd like to continue that role, can I send you to some outside training? Would you be willing to lead a change agent group inside of our team? Right. So all of a sudden, my people leader sees me differently than somebody who just looks at me and says, I don't know why Karen's not adopting this change, right? What is her problem, right? She was so good before.
mm,
We need this change. But again, it's that sitting inside. So our people leaders play a really critical role, the people who are coaching. And I'm going to keep coming back to ADKAR because there's so many powerful components, but you can coach an employee if you're like, I don't know what to say. I just give me some guidance here. I don't know what to say for somebody who might be struggling or exhibiting signs of fatigue or apathy, or they're checking out, or you just feel there's something that's not quite right. But you can sit down and say, Do you know why this change is happening? Do you know why it's happening now? Have you chosen to participate, to support in this change? Are there any barriers that you're experiencing? You know, the example of a subject matter expert role, that is a way to reinforce my movement because I might go, you know what? I couldn't put words to that, but I was feeling less important. I am feeling not seen or neglected because I had such an important SME role, right? It was to me, maybe even ego driven, but it was something that was important to me. So desire gets into those individual and organizational motivators. And some people just don't think they can make the transition, right? The knowledge, is just so different than what their background in the history. You know, I'm 40 years into my career. And what I was trained up in early as a young professional is so different today, right? The generations that are coming into the workforce today are so very different. So I still hold on to, just because of the nature of human learning, the way I did things when I was early in my career. So, ADKAR gives us the language for the conversations and the coaching. I think the other thing that's important to understand is changes don't happen in isolation. So if you were to take, and again, this is an interesting exercise for those of you who are listening, can you make a list of all of the changes that are happening inside of your organization? You might bucket them by strategic initiatives or the IT initiatives or operational initiatives or continuous improvement or just the BAU business as usual, tweaks and changes that we make on a day-to-day basis. So if you think about it, people, especially as a change practitioner, if I'm leading or engaged in a certain change, I may be doing everything perfectly. The way I'm engaging my leaders and my people managers and my effective communications and the way I'm focused on knowledge to ability and reinforcement and sustainment and all of the things around ensuring change sticks. But I am now sitting there with one change against 10 or hundreds, or I've seen thousands of lists of things that are happening inside of organizations. So sometimes it's fatigue just associated with so much change, and that requires a different set of interventions. And we can talk about that. But I think it's just the acknowledgement and recognition of what's actually happening inside of our organizations.
Mm. Another problem that or challenge that I remember back in my days in corporate is the fact that whenever the change is not giving the expected results, there is like getting a moment where management or the staff may consider to get back to the old way of doing things, especially, yeah, because of the challenges, the setbacks that they have got. Sometimes they might be right, but very often it's almost like throwing the water of the bath and the baby at the same time. Is there a way to 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 validate correctly if this change should stop, you should pivot completely, or that that there is something to mitigate, in fact, the risk of going back to the old ways?
Yeah, sustainment is critical. And it's interesting, right? We talk about project management and change management being complementary disciplines with a common objective.
Hmm.
So we would hope that our friends and colleagues on the project management side, the technical side of the change, have a success metric, right, for what success looks like. And so do we on the change
Hmm.
management side, the engage, adopt, and use. But what oftentimes happens is that go live or the minute that we instantiate the change is when the project management team cycles off, right? Their go live date is their completion date. And what we know from a change perspective is that's the beginning of the change. That's when the change is actually real,
Indeed.
when people can say, oh, so that's what it really is. So all of the sustainment mechanisms, right, need to happen after go live to ensure people are, reinforced and sustained and celebrated and all of the ways that we sustain change. But it means also that we have to be open to listening to feedback, to understanding why people might be reverting to previous behaviors. And sometimes, I'll tell you what, underneath of it, there's a very logical explanation, right? Somebody might say, There was a feature in the new system that didn't meet, a need that I have, right? I've been running this Excel spreadsheet for 10 years, and I tried to produce a report that articulated that same information, and I wasn't able to do it. So, here's my Excel spreadsheet. So again, you get underneath of it. So I think sustainment is, a post go live challenge. It is not a go live challenge, right? That's the launch challenge, not the sustainment challenge. So again, sustainment is a phase in and of itself, and we need to figure out when we're going to measure our benefits and outcomes. And oftentimes it's not the day after go live, it's several days, weeks, or even months or years later. So again, it's the understanding the simplicity that sits on the other side of complexity, that change isn't in itself complex, but there's structure and process and resources and tools and ways to break it down into smaller pieces and to get through the process successfully.
You made me think about a mini gossip that I remember that a project was not sustained because the sponsor of the project left only 1 week after the go live of the project. So when the sponsor of the project disappeared, poof, everything got
Yeah.
deleted, and that change didn't happen.
Yeah. And
Karen,
that's a place, again, you can
yeah.
plan for things to go wrong. We like to call it in our household, we call it breakdown avoidance, right? We're taking this big trip and there's a lot of complexities. What are the breakdowns that could occur and what can we do to avoid them? Now, Prosci research has lots of guidances, right? What if you lose your sponsor? What if your sponsor is not at the right level? What if your sponsor is not actively engaging? Again, there's thousands and thousands of, over 25 years of data points around doing that. But I think at the end of the day, you have to have a mitigation. So if you lose your sponsor, can you activate a sponsor coalition proxy for that particular sponsor? Can you make sure that the words and phrases and actions that they've used get re-articulated, even though they may not be there to send them themselves? So again, what can you do to ensure, and then, just be able to respond, with guidance and trust and belief, that there are positive ways to get through change, and building change capability is worth it. Right at the end of the day, let's all be able to say, you know what, change is difficult, or it can be. Not all changes are. Some are very welcome and we're very ready and we roll into them very quickly, right? So, I don't want to put all change into the same bucket. So there are factors that make some changes riskier than others, and there are people and cultures that make some changes riskier than others. But to just, take it on as, a focus and a discipline. There's a body of work and there are people that are experts at this. And I just recommend you find them and make them part of your team.
You know what? I recognize that we needed a little bit more of time in order to expand all of the questions that I still have, because there is so much wealth of information on what you are saying regarding change management, what happens behind the scenes, that I find it quite insightful. Karen, if people want to reach out to you to ask you questions about change management, about how to make it happen, about some tricks and tips, how can they reach you out, Karen?
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, I always recommend that you can go to prosci.com, prosci.com. Feel free to reach out to me personally on LinkedIn. Happy to connect with you, Karen Ball 26 on LinkedIn. And of course, if you're interested, or I piqued any ideas or thoughts that you might be interested in taking a look at the ADKAR book. It was just published in 2024, and it's an update of the 2006 version of the book, and I incorporated lots more stories. It demonstrates the promise, the proof, and the practice of applying ADKAR to deliver successful change outcomes.
I will definitely put the links of prosci.com, your LinkedIn profile, and a direct link to the book, because
Yep, it's available on Amazon as well as all the audio listening platforms.
that would be great. Karen, thank you very much for making the time. I really enjoyed the conversation. And I think that there is so much value that my audience is going to find through all of the wealth of experience that you have been mentioning during this episode. Thank you very much, Karen.
Thank you for having me.